My special guest today is a Christian. Amanda Tyler is Executive Director of the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty. She is also lead organizer for Christians Against Christian Nationalism. That's an organization I've talked about and written about quite a bit. She co-hosts the Respecting Religion podcast, and we are allies in the fight to protect state-church separation. Amanda Tyler, this sounds like the start of a joke, right? An atheist and a Baptist walk into a bar or restaurant or cafe or something like that.
Or Zoom room, right?
It's great to have you. It's so nice to be able to talk to you here on the show. Thanks for being here.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Seth.
Before we get into the meat of the discussion here, here's a question that I would ask you over coffee, okay? And this is somebody who I was raised in a Baptist school. I spent years in a Baptist church. You're a Baptist. What is your take on the whole Southern Baptist Convention thing when it comes to women? It was just 3 months ago, something like that. They ousted 5 churches, including the mega church, right? Saddleback Church in California. And the reason they ousted them is because they had female pastors and women in positions of pastoral leadership. From the SBC's own policy, quote, "The office of pastor is limited to men as qualified by Scripture." You're a Baptist woman in a point position. What's your perspective on all this?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to understand how diverse and large the Baptist movement is. People often ask, what's the position of the Baptist Church? And I start by saying, well, there is no Baptist church. It's not like the Catholic Church. It's rather a movement. Baptists are famously disorganized. So I just want to start by saying Southern Baptist is not synonymous with Baptist. In fact, the Southern Baptist Convention is not one of the supporting bodies of Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, the organization I lead, though it was for many years. I myself am not a Southern Baptist, though I was for many years. And so there's some complexity to this question and to just the concept of what it means to be a Baptist. So let me say that up front. I think second, it's important to note that this current position that the Southern Baptist Convention has is not a position they have always had. So it's interesting for them to be so dogmatic on this issue of Scripture when it wasn't even a position that they have always held, even within my lifetime, for that matter. And so, it is not a theological position that I hold. I would defend their right to hold that position as a matter of religious freedom within their denomination. They can make choices about who they call to leadership. And I do think that that's something that the state doesn't have any control over. But I also note that their theological position is also coming at the same time that the Southern Baptist Convention is waning, in part because of the way that they have treated women within their denomination, not just in roles of pastoral leadership, but also with a number of instances of sexual abuse and misconduct. So all of that to say, it's a very messy situation, and I just want to leave your listeners knowing that the Southern Baptist Convention does not speak for all Baptists, and certainly doesn't speak for this Baptist.
I just want to make sure this isn't a setup, right? I'm not saying the Baptist, because when I was being raised, it was Southern Baptist, or you Free Will Baptist, or an Independent Baptist. We see all of these different denominations and in different interpretations. And people do this all the time. They say it about the Muslims or the Jews or the atheists. We tend to want to have a cookie cutter model or portrait of who and what they are. But, they probably almost certainly base it back in the New Testament out of 1 Corinthians, the women should keep silent in the churches. They are not permitted to speak, but should be in submission. How do you approach a scripture like that as a Baptist?
Well, I approach Scripture and religion in general from a posture of freedom, of an idea of freedom to understand and interpret Scripture on our own. I don't interpret Scripture literally or from a fundamentalist perspective, though I understand that a number of people do. So I think that Scripture is something that is open to our own interpretation and understanding, and I don't take those scriptures out of context, right? I also don't believe in proof texting from Scripture, but thinking about it as a whole and thinking about the Spirit of God and as God as a freedom-loving entity that wants freedom for us as well. So the God that I believe in is one that calls all people to different forms of ministry, and that doesn't distinguish between men and women in terms of ability to preach and hold other positions of church leadership.
So you're a Christian, but you and I join in being critics and sounding the alarms about Christian nationalists. How do you define the difference?
Well, absolutely. We are allies in this cause of working to call attention to Christian nationalism and to dismantle it, which is going to be decades, if not centuries, work to dismantle Christian nationalism from our culture. But I define Christian nationalism as a political ideology and a cultural framework that seeks to merge our identities as Christians and Americans, suggesting that to be a true American, one has to be a Christian. And this undercuts the promise of religious freedom for all that is included in the U.S. Constitution, one that says that our belonging in American society should not depend on what we believe, or how we worship, or how we identify religiously, or even if we're religious at all. And so that central idea of equality, regardless of religion, is attacked by Christian nationalism. But as a Christian, I also find Christian nationalism to be a gross distortion of the Christian faith that I hold dear. It takes the central message of Christianity, which is a gospel of love, and turns it into a false idol of power. And so I'm sure that we both share our deep concerns about what Christian nationalism is doing to our democracy, what it's doing to these foundational principles of religious freedom for all people, regardless of religious identity. And as a Christian, I'm also deeply concerned about what Christian nationalism does to an authentic Christian witness and to societal understanding of what Christianity is.
But the Bible declares that not just a nation, any nation, but the entire planet really is the property of the Christian God. Even after Adam was given dominion over all the earth, you get into the Psalm 24, right? The earth is the Lord's and everything in it. And so if these people are standing on Scripture, I mean, they claim, perhaps biblically, that it's all Christian, or it all should be Christian. How would you respond to that?
Well, I think there are lots of it links back to the way we began our conversation today. There are so many links between fundamentalist religion and Christian nationalism as an ideology. Both try to use Scripture in a very literal sense, claiming that their interpretation of Scripture is the only way to interpret Scripture, and then proof text using those Scriptures to defend whatever their political views are. And I don't find, and millions of other Christians agree with me, don't find that is an accurate depiction of our faith, that the ideas of our faith are encompassed in a God that loves everyone, that believes in everyone's equality, that wants the best for God's creation, and that would not use that theology in one of these other iterations. I think some of what you might be getting into is this dominionist theology, this theology that uses a particular scripture as proof for a political agenda, one that would use religion to take over every sphere of society and use that to lord over others. That cuts against Jesus's command for us to love our neighbors as ourselves. If we love our neighbor as ourselves, then we protect their religious freedom as we would our own. And so it's these Christian principles that lead me to be in this fight against Christian nationalism and to protect your religious freedom, Seth, your freedom to choose not to be religious as zealously as I protect my own, as zealously as I would protect my Muslim neighbors, my Jewish neighbors, and my Southern Baptist neighbors, for that matter, that we all have a right to believe or not believe, and we have rights to act on our beliefs as long as they don't come into conflict or infringe on the rights of others without necessary state involvement. And so it's those principles of religious freedom that is the work of the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, the group I lead, as well as what is inspiring the Christians in our movement at Christians Against Christian Nationalism.
I'm struck by the performative nature of so much of what you and I see, sort of grandstanding, this sort of chest thumping. I'm reminded of that verse out of Matthew 6. Jesus had said, "When you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by men. But when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen." A lot of grandstanding out there. I know you've seen it, right?
I have. And when I hear that scripture, I have to tell you, I wasn't anticipating so much scripture and Bible study in our conversation
This is
today,
what happens when you speak to an ex-Christian who's been 30 years in the faith. We are able to sort of play in that same sandbox. So
yeah,
okay.
No, and I love conversations like these. And I think, when I hear that scripture, how I understand how that's relevant to our life today is that Jesus cares much more about how we live our lives than about how we perform our lives, how we live out our faith, not how we talk about our faith. And so I think we do see examples of people who would much more like to show that they're Christians by saying certain things or praying in certain ways than by living their life in service of others.
Okay. You actually attended, this is a bit of a digression, but I saw this, I think on your Twitter feed. You actually attended the Reawaken America tour. Is that correct?
I did. I went to its latest stop. It's this traveling road show that's been all over the country.
Okay,
but its
and
latest
forgive me
stop
for interjecting,
was in Miami.
but
yeah.
I know I have a lot of people who may not be aware of it. So before you tell me about your experience, please flesh it out. Was it, Charlie Kirk or Roger Stone or the My Pillow guy? I mean, who was there, and what's the whole flavor of Reawaken America, if you would?
So Reawaken America Tour is something that started back in 2021 by someone named Clay Clark, working closely with Michael Flynn, disgraced General Michael Flynn. And they have been to a number of places across the country, often in churches, sometimes in other community spaces. And these events draw a few thousand people at each stop. It is a mix of Christian nationalism, COVID conspiracies, election denial, with some marketing on the side. And I first became aware of the Reawaken America tour back in November of 2021, when it had one of its first stops in San Antonio, Texas, at a church where Michael Flynn said the quiet part out loud. He said, we're one nation under God. We should have one religion. And that caught my attention because, of course, how at odds that is with the U.S. Constitution, with America's promise of religious freedom for all. And then I've been paying attention to these stops because I find them deeply concerning and even dangerous, the way that they mix election denialism, COVID conspiracy, and Christian nationalism in a way that really could lead to more political violence in the future. And so when we learned that the tour was going to be at a Trump property in Miami, Florida, we decided at Christians Against Christian Nationalism, working with our partners at Faithful America, to organize a public response, to have a counter witness to the version of Christianity that's on display at the Reawaken America tour in this guise of Christian nationalism. And so we did some advertising around Miami. We actually rented a barge that had some advertising of Christians Against Christian Nationalism that sailed around the Miami River, had some mobile billboards, had a press conference, but also decided while we were there to actually go into the conference itself to get a feel for what it was like. And yes, I saw Mike Lindell speak. I saw Michael Flynn. I saw Roger Stone. Saw Greg Locke, who's one of these Christian nationalist pastors. It was the whole crowd, right? That and it was a constant drumbeat of exactly what I've said. COVID conspiracy theories. In fact, when we bought our tickets, the first thing they said is just be sure not to wear a mask. If you wear a mask, you'll be thrown out of the conference. That was the one thing we could not bring in. And so COVID and, a lot of mistrust of government and lies about vaccines, that figured heavily in a lot of the programming, as did election lies, as did Trumpism. And of course, what was uniting throughout the entire event was Christian nationalism, how all of this was done in Jesus's name, using kind of cherry picking some of the more fiery scriptures from the Bible to galvanize this crowd, and at times to call in very thinly veiled calls for violence, which was what was so deeply concerning to me. And also it was deeply concerning to me to see the response from the crowd. I do think that the leaders very much have political aims in mind and are just using the language of religion to try to galvanize the crowd. But for the people there, I think many of them, this truly is a religious experience. They understand that their religion and their allegiance to Trump is so mixed up that they have a difficult time telling the difference between the two. And so it was very eye-opening, instructive, alarming for me to see this for myself when I was in Miami last month.
Do you remember, I'm sure you've seen the photographs from CPAC, from, I don't know, the Conservative Political Action Committee, and they had a gold idol of Donald Trump.
I remember that.
Like a golden calf. And they didn't see the irony. And I still can't believe it. What was your reaction?
Well, that's Christian nationalism right there. It merges political leadership with religious authority in ways that lead to idolatry. And, I also saw this in the way that they have appropriated the sacred symbolism of baptism. I'm a Baptist. Baptism is very important to me and to my particular expression of Christianity. But at these Reawaken America tours, people are baptized in pools of water, but it's unclear into what exactly they're being baptized into. There's no liturgy at all, and many of them are baptized in Trump shirts or in QAnon shirts, whatever they're wearing to the conference, in ways that really look like you're being baptized into a religion of Trumpism and Christian nationalism, not Christianity. But in using the sacred symbols of Christianity, to observers, it looks like the same thing. And that is deeply troubling to me as a Christian.
As someone who you didn't sneak into Reawaken America, but you were sort of there. Am I to understand that they forbade masks, but you could probably carry a firearm in there? Is that true?
Yeah. Well, there were certainly no signs saying that you could not have a weapon. They did not tell us not to bring a weapon. There were no metal detectors. And the night before the conference started, there was a gathering for a new organization called Pastors for Trump. It's a 501c4 organization, organized to intervene in the election. They had their first ever in-person gathering. It was standing room only, crowded ballroom at the Trump Resort. And one of the pastors who spoke from the stage after his speech, after he called up Michael Flynn to speak to the crowd, he whispered to Flynn, who then repeated to the crowd that he was packing at that moment. So not only do I assume some people did have weapons, but this pastor bragged from the stage right after he had told a story about how we want our enemies surrounding us because then we can shoot in all directions, that he actually had a gun on him at that moment. And that was one of the more alarming moments of the conference for me. And that's what I was talking about with these calls for violence and this appeal to violence, which again is so against the Christianity that I know, a peace-loving religion, and certainly not a religion that tells us to turn the other cheek, not to resort in violence, that it's very different expression of Christianity in this form of Christian nationalism that I saw firsthand at Reawaken America and at this Pastors for Trump event.
I know many of my viewers and listeners are like wanting me to have theological discussions with you about the nature of God and the scriptures. And I'm sitting on the edge of my chair. The activist in me, and I'm sure the activist in you would probably, we could go to coffee and there would be a whole day, right? And it would be an amazing and pleasant conversation. But I want to stay with kind of where we are. Texas, they were this close with Senate Bill 1515 to place the 10 Commandments in all public school classrooms. It stalled. It missed a time deadline. It did not pass. I believe they have moved for chaplains, unlicensed chaplains, to be school counselors. And I watched this guy, a Christian and an ally, James Tallarico. He's a politician in Texas, and he opposed the 10 Commandments bill because he said it was idolatry.
Representative Noble, I know you're a devout Christian, and so am I. This bill, to me, is not only unconstitutional, it's not only un-American, I think it is also deeply un-Christian. And I say that because I believe this bill is idolatrous, I believe it is exclusionary, and I believe it is arrogant. And those three things, in my reading of the gospel, are diametrically opposed to the teachings of Jesus.
So I'm from Texas. I'm from Austin, actually. So this hits very close to home, what's going on in Texas. And I was appalled when I heard about this bill that would require the posting of the 10 Commandments in every public school classroom. Talk about taking us back. This was a bad idea decades ago when Kentucky tried to do it and the Supreme Court said it was unconstitutional. And emboldened by some misguided recent opinions from the U.S. Supreme Court, the lawmakers in Texas decided, well, we're going to test this court. We're going to go for broke. We're going to go after this bill. And a real example of Christian nationalism and the language they use to try to justify an educational reason for this bill. Telling lies basically that all of American law is based on the 10 Commandments, when there is, in fact, no such case to be made that American law is based on the 10 Commandments, and then pushing for this government sponsorship of religion. Talk about government picking and choosing between religions. In this case, picking an edited version of a sacred text, right? So that's another. There are different versions of the 10 Commandments, even within the Bible. There are different versions of 10 Commandments that Judaism uses, and even that different expressions of Christianity use. So the government's picking sides by picking any version of the 10 Commandments. And then they've picked an edited version, and then they've turned what is a religious text into some pseudo patriotic text. So there's so many troubling layers of violations of religious freedom for all in this bill. I am concerned that other states might pick up the mantle and might try to do copycat legislation in other places. And so we're ready. We're ready with our arguments, and we're ready to help mobilize people of all faiths and none to stand up against this legislation and explain why it's an attack on everyone's religious freedom for the government to play this role.
Here in my home state of Oklahoma, we've got Superintendent of Public Instruction, Ryan Walters, and I mean, he's hardcore. He's so hardcore that many of his fellow GOPers are saying, we got to do something about this guy. Like, he's so extreme. And so we're waiting for the 10 Commandments, classrooms, chaplains, etc. It's interesting to me. I've done exercises where I see people bleat on about the necessity of displaying the 10 Commandments, public schools, courthouse lawns, the state capitol building, etc. And so I say, all right, well, fine. I got $40 in my pocket. I'll pay you whatever's in my wallet if you can give me 7 of the 10. And most people don't even come close. How much of this do you think is just about marking territory? It's not about the commandments for a lot of people. Do you think it's just like, this is a brand that says the Bible, Christianity, so now this belongs to us? You think they're just marking territory?
I think there's a lot going on. I think that's part of it. I think part of it is, again, furthering this Christian nationalism ideology that to really belong here, you have to have some kind of religious identity, specifically a Christian identity, even more specifically, a particular kind of Christian fundamentalist identity that aligns with certain political positions. So I definitely think that's part of it. I also think in the Texas example and in other examples, it's used as a distraction from dealing with real policy to address, for instance, education, or in Texas, gun control. A lot of times people will say, well, if we just had more religion in the public schools, we would have less violence. But instead of like really putting forward some serious policies to deal with the epidemic of gun violence, they have this distraction of having more government-sponsored religious exercise in the public schools. So I do think that there is quite a bit going on, and there is this very well-funded movement that is pushing Christian nationalism in all different areas of our society and government. And this 10 Commandments bill is one that I think some people saw as low-hanging fruit, particularly in a state like Texas. And so it is a victory, and one that we need to celebrate in these difficult times for it to have not passed at the end of the day.
If I was to move to Texas, I'd live in Austin, a progressive town, and the aesthetic's nice. I don't know how it is in the summertime. Texas in the summer scares me a little bit. I'm sorry, I'm digressing. Talking
Austin
here with
Austin's a great place.
Okay, all right. Well, I'm glad to hear that endorsement from a native. Amanda Tyler is executive director of the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty. She leads the Christians Against Christian Nationalism. Would I say leader or lead organizer, or what's your position with him?
Well, the Christians Against Christian Nationalism is a project of BJC. And so I call myself the lead organizer because it's really a grassroots movement of Christians who are concerned about Christian nationalism and called to to make a public stand against it.
Okay, well, I'm going to come back to that. I don't want to bury the lead too, deeply into our conversation, but I want to really get into this organization because I'm a fan. Okay. We're seeing this rise of anti-Semitism. We've seen bigotry against Jews since forever, but it's really on the rise. We're seeing it in the spotlight more and more. The bigots often waving Bibles. I'm not saying that anti-Semitism is exclusive to Christianity. It certainly isn't. But I'm hearing a lot of like the Holocaust example, the blood curse upon the Jews. They link it to Matthew 27, his blood be upon us. And that excuses why God didn't intervene during the Holocaust as 6 million Jews were murdered. You're watching this rise in Jewish hate. Talk about that from your vantage, if you would.
Absolutely. I think it's important that we talk about the real life implications, the real world implications on our neighbors, including our Jewish neighbors. And it was the shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh of 2018 that was, in fact, one of the main galvanizing events that led us to start Christians Against Christian Nationalism. The shooting at Tree of Life Synagogue remains the deadliest attack on Jews on American soil ever, in October of 2018, coming, just over a year after the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville with with hate groups marching through Charlottesville, Virginia, yelling, "Jews will not replace us," with tiki torches. These are violent expressions of anti-Semitism, deadly expressions of anti-Semitism. And since then, we have seen a rise in the normalization of anti-Semitism, whether it be from the repeating of tropes and hate from celebrities to banners being hung off highways in cities across this country. This feeling of we are seeing not a decline in hate, but actually a very sharp rise in hate. And that is in part what led the Biden administration last month to release its first ever national strategy to combat anti-Semitism, more than 100 actions. And I was actually asked to be part of listening sessions that the White House held around that policy, in which I talked about how Christian nationalism was a major driver of anti-Semitism. And I approached this work not only because of my professional work, leading Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, my commitment to religious freedom for all people, my religious identity as a Christian who cares about the faith freedom of my neighbors as much as I do my own, but also from a very personal vantage point. My husband is Jewish. I am an interfaith family. I feel the threat of anti-Semitism to my family members, to my friends. And it is a tragedy that we are living in this country now where our Jewish neighbors do not feel fully safe to live in our society. And so it's up to all of us to stand against it and to understand how Christian nationalism drives it, how Christian nationalism, even when they appeal to quote unquote Judeo-Christian values, they're really talking about Christian values. They're using Judeo there as window dressing because we see, and I saw it again at the Reawaken America tour, even though they disinvited the most virulent anti-Semitic speakers, there was still plenty of anti-Semitism laced throughout the speeches that I did hear. And it is this poisonous hatred that is really very dangerous and urgent in our country today.
This may be a stretch. I may be too clever on this, outsmarting myself. But, there's a biblical tradition that the Jews descended directly from the ancient Israelites, are the chosen people. I feel a temperature of that from Christian nationalists. We are the chosen. We are special. We're first class. Everybody else is second class. Am I trying too hard, Amanda?
Not at all. In fact, BJC hosted a program recently with Dr. Catherine Breckus, a lecture called "The Myth of American Chosenness," and this idea that this myth of chosenness that really is this revisionist made-up history that God has a special plan for the American people in God's plan for the world. It is a dangerous ideology because it does create special citizenship for Americans and specifically for American Christians above everyone else. And as a Christian, it goes against that famous passage in John 3:16. Doesn't say that God so loved the United States. It says God so loved the world, right? And so it is against the gospel of God's love for everyone to single out the United States as having some special place in God's plan. And I think that you're right there for God to have selected the United States and in some place, over the Jewish people, also carries with it some inherent anti-Semitism in just that idea, and in appropriating that idea for this, again, political ideology of Christian nationalism.
I'm sitting on the edge of my chair again, Amanda, because, I look at the Bible and I think, well, the best version of Jesus is amazing. But I also realize that, there are conditions and there are pretty harsh penalties for those who don't toe the line, for those who don't drop to their knees and confess and accept, etc. And so I love this version of Jesus, but I can't help but wonder if we I don't know, fashion our own gods sounds, I don't mean for that to sound condescending in any way, but I feel like we have gods that sort of ring true to our values. Your Jesus is an amazing Jesus. Uh, uh, is that the Jesus of Scripture? You know, the God that created hell and that separated the sheep and the goats and said, "Depart from me, all you who are cursed, into the lake of everlasting fire." I mean, let's go into the weeds for a second. How do you reconcile that?
Yeah, I think this is a beautiful conversation, and I think it calls into how personal theology and religion is to me and to many other people. But my understanding, my experience of Jesus, my understanding of religion is a religion of love that God has for me, that is not special and above the love that God has for every living thing. And that Jesus is God's expression of God's love for the world, that Jesus would come and live among us and live a human life and experience all the things that humans experience, and that we can feel a special closeness and kinship with God because of the incarnation of God in the person of Jesus. But of course, Jesus also gives us this amazing example of what it means to show the love of God to every person that we meet. If we really were to follow the example of Jesus, and not just the teachings that he left us, but the example he left us of how he lived his life, I believe the world would approximate God's wish for the world, God's kingdom on earth, if we truly lived the way that Jesus lived. So that's how I understand that Jesus in the Bible and the scriptures and the stories and the work. I'm not trying to say that the Bible as a piece of many books, right? It is not one book. I do not believe that in the literal interpretation of scripture, I do not believe that it is one. There's all kinds of human intervention in scripture in many different ways. So I'm not trying to say that the Bible is not an uncomplicated text, and I think it deserves serious reckoning and reconciling. But that's the work of religion and the work of a lifetime. So that's my personal
That's fine.
position on it.
I'm not coming after you. I just, as we're talking, this is the kind of stuff that goes on in my mind, and I'm just like, oh, that'd be interesting to talk about.
I welcome it. I love it.
Okay, good. Well, I don't want to be that guy, you know. I've seen this phrase or sentence out there. I'll just say it. The cruelty is the point. Trump, DeSantis, many of these hardcore Christian nationalist types are cruel toward their fellow human beings, toward non-Christians, toward LGBT people, toward people of foreign nations. And this seems to be the version of strength that, there are some people who think, well, you need to go in and throw your weight around. And if you don't, you're weak. And if you're weak, you're a loser. It's very Trumpian. I'm just cruelty. Can we talk about that, Amanda?
Yeah. I mean, I think you're right. And I think it's hard to talk about the kind of cruelty you're talking about without talking about power, about using power in ways that oppress other people. And if, since we're having this really rich theological conversation, and you've invited my views on how this Christian nationalism departs from how I understand Christianity. Jesus was someone who was always on the side of the oppressed, the marginalized. Jesus was never on the side of power. Jesus was not a cruel person. Jesus was executed by the state for speaking truth to power, by threatening the status quo. So this cruelty that I do think that you aptly name is at odds with Christianity, and then to use the language of Christianity, use the symbols of Christianity to justify it. I mean, the image that's popping into my mind is Trump with the Bible in front of St. John's Church outside of Lafayette Square right after he had cleared the square of peaceful protesters using chemical agents. The sense of trying to justify that cruelty in the face of peaceful First Amendment protest, and to do so with a holy symbol was deeply offensive to Christians all over the place, right? And so I think that sense of cruelty is part of what is driving the righteous outrage that many people feel about Christian nationalism and the impact on our neighbors.
It would be interesting to see Jesus arrive in the United States in the year 2023, right? An immigrant of color. How might that Jesus be treated today? I don't know. It's a hypothetical. You've been generous with your time. Tell me about Christians Against Christian Nationalism. I mean, you got Baptist ministers, you got Catholic women leaders, which the Catholic Church, I think, would be weird about, but okay. You've got reverends representing what? Presbyterian and Episcopal, Church of Christ, Lutherans. You've got theology professors, higher ups, mega pastors. I mean, Tony Campolo is a freaking franchise player, right? He's a big name. This is an amazing thing that you guys are doing. Flesh it out. Christians Against Christian Nationalism.
So Christians Against Christian Nationalism is a growing movement of Christians, both clergy and lay, who are committed to calling out Christian nationalism as an urgent threat to democracy and as a perversion and distortion of our faith. And the names that you've named there are some of our early endorsers of the project, but they represent we're now up to more than 33,000 Christians who have joined our movement. And what makes our project distinct, one is it really does represent a broad diversity of Christian expression in this country. It represents urban, rural, suburban. More than 6 dozen different Christian denominations are represented among the signers. So it's really across the ideological spectrum. We have signers in every congressional district in this country, and it's all open source. The list is public on the website, and so it can be it is meant to be a tool, an organizing tool for people in local communities to find like-minded Christians who are likewise concerned about Christian nationalism and try to push back against what they're seeing in their communities. And we started the project. Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, the group that I lead, organizes the project. We started it in 2019, and we are in the next phase of the project where we're really scaling it for growth and impact. And our next way that we're scaling it is to really go into local organizing. And we are piloting our first local organizing project in North Texas, so just south of the Red River from where you are, where we are going to be hiring an organizer and working to work with people on the ground, not just Christians, but also with our allies who are non-religious, allies who are from different faith traditions. How can we raise our collective voice and our diverse coalition to push back against Christian nationalism as it is showing up in our local communities? Because we know it's happening on the national level, it's happening on the state level, but where it has the most impact is when it happens in our neighborhoods, when it happens at our schools, when it happens at our school boards, when it's happening with violence in our communities. And we want to make a difference on the ground. And so I hope you can hear the passion in my voice, the commitment that we have to this project, to really making a difference and to finally making some progress on dismantling this poisonous ideology.
And it's important, I think, that people like you and I share the same space and talk in this way. We tend to, especially in the age of the internet, we like to talk about people in bumper stickers. We make these tiny cookie cutters and labels, and you are this. And, Christians have done it to atheists and, other religions, and atheists have done it to Christians. Another way people do it to people, tribes do it to each other, in grouping, out grouping. And I just think, boy, having a shared humanity and having this shared sense of values, Greta Vosper is a reverend up in Canada, and she's got this great line that's values are more important than beliefs. And I think I hold to that. You and I are on the side of humanity. You ever get any hardcore types who give you beyond the cranks and the trolls and all those people? You ever have people who say, well, you guys aren't true Christians? This enterprise, you guys, this is not true Christianity. You've betrayed the faith. You ever get that?
Oh, sure. I mean, there are, because that's part of what Christian nationalism does to people. It says that there's only one way to be Christian. And so this idea of this beautiful diversity of Christian expression is that whole idea is something that they reject. So I'm not surprised when they say that. And so, I don't treat them in kind. I don't say, well, you're not a real Christian. In fact, I honor that that's their Christian expression. But what my calling is to help organize and those of us who view Christianity differently and who have concerns about Christian nationalism, for us to take our rightful place in the public square to push back against those other expressions. And, I am in spaces a lot with people who are from other faith traditions and from people who don't claim a faith tradition at all. From a theological perspective, this is something that Baptists have been doing for centuries. And part of it is because we think it's important. We think that we have freedom of choice to say yes to God, and our yes to God is meaningless if we don't have the opportunity to say no. And so we stand up for everyone's opportunity to say yes or no to God, right? That's again from our theological position. And so being in spaces like this today, and I also wanted to highlight our work with the Freedom from Religion Foundation that we did on a report on Christian nationalism in January 6th. And I think it's important for us to come together because I recognize that people from non-religious tradition, from atheists, agnostic, humanists, they are often the ones who are most attacked in our country under Christian nationalism, in addition to other impacted groups. And so I think it's important for Christians to stand up and explain that our religious identity has nothing to do with our belonging, or should not have anything to do with our belonging in American society.
If there's anything that I can do to help support you, like if there's ever an extra seat for a heathen on the bus, I'll sit on the bus next to you, Amanda. You and I will shoulder to shoulder. I think I often phrase it this way. I'm weary. I was telling Natalie, I'm weary of so many people out there who simply don't want to share this world. Like there's room for all of us. There is space for all 8 billion of us, and yet so many simply don't want to share this world. And I fight despair, and I fight burnout, and I wonder, well, are we just circling the drain? How do you overcome? I mean, obviously you have optimism. How do you push through that as we wrap up?
Well, I feel like we're making progress, right? There's so much to do, but I just think even us having this conversation, having a national conversation about Christian nationalism, that's progress. James Baldwin said, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed if it's not faced. And so I feel buoyed every time we face Christian nationalism in the face, right? And in the eyes, and say, no, not today. We are going to join together. We're going to join together across all different kinds of difference. And we're going to stand up for this religious freedom tradition that has enriched our country and that can enrich everyone's lives. So I am not naive about how hard this fight is, but I'm convinced that it's the fight that we need to be in. And I'm pleased to be on the bus with you, Seth. I think this is work that we can do together.
Yeah. And I want people to see us as an example. I mean, Amanda, Seth, in this way, we're allies and we share this world. And I think it's been amazing. And it's been an honor being able to speak with you. Amanda Tyler, Executive Director of the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty. I'm going to include a link to Christians Against Christian Nationalism and that insurrection study, the January 6th study that you were a part of, because it's huge. And I think it's probably the definitive work on what that day represented, especially tied to Christian nationalism. So I'm going to tie people to you and your work. You've been amazing. Thanks so much for talking to me.
Oh, thank you.